Hi, welcome to 3D Brand's first interview. When I started thinking about 3D Brand several years ago, one of my goals was to host these interviews monthly or so with past colleagues or clients or consultants that really do have that big brand experience and do it through the lens of helping smaller brands or not for profits. So, my goal is to occasionally reach out, and if you're interested, please hit me up. But to just have candid conversations about what brand building is like in today's age and from their experience on their big brands, what can they take and apply it to smaller brands or not for profits. So thank you, Jenna, for being interview number one. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Jenna Gilday, whose career spans some of the most recognizable brands in the world. She's worked on Target to Wells Fargo to most recently Chewy Pets. What makes Jenna's experience so valuable, and especially for these smaller brands and not for profits, is her ability to translate that big thinking into meaningful, actionable brand building. We're excited to learn from her today, not just about what makes a great campaign, but what makes a great brand. So, Jenna, welcome and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Dustin. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, you've seen brands build trust, spark loyalty, and even shift culture. Why, at the end of the day, does brands still matter so much? Like, even for these small brands or not for profits or these businesses that are just trying to find their voice?
This is a great question because it's sometimes easy to be like it doesn't matter. But I think first and foremost, there's kind of three areas I'll cover. The first is really it tells customers who you are and what you stand for. And so if you can really define your brand well, you stand out from the competition, you're communicating your unique values to the customer. And why that matters is statistically, you know that shoppers want to shop brands that align to their own values. So if they don't know what you stand for, you might not even make it into their consideration set. The second area is that a strong brand can actually drive business results by bringing in customer acquisition and driving retention and loyalty. So as you think of a strong brand, it really lets people know kind of what you're standing for, as we said. But then also, it is aligning on those values. It's conveying trust and reliability. You're communicating the quality and price point of where you sit that are really the things that are in the decision making process for customers to bring new customers to your brand. And then once customers are in, your brand and the experience they have with you builds that trust over time and can build that loyalty and retention that they stay with your brand. And the last component I kind of think of as creating this sense of comfort or belonging or sense of community. And if you're building a brand right, it becomes recognizable. Customers recall and identify them, but there's also a familiarity and trust. If they know they've bought your products and they've had a good experience, there's a security and comfort in knowing they can come back to you. And then also, too, if you're communicating your values that align to them, they can feel a sense of belonging and actually be someone who becomes a brand advocate for you, where they have this emotional connection to your brand and they actually want to share positive things and experiences about your brand with others without you asking them to.
No, I think that's well said. It's consumers are craving that emotional connection, and a brand can be a bit of that. It can be of something they purchase. It represents part of their personality. It can be a community that they participate in, but it's, you know, we live in a society where brands do become that extension of their personality, and they're looking for like-minded, you know, things or people or brands to share that experience with.
Exactly. And I think that connection is so important. And if you do it right, like I said, I've worked for brands that have big advocates, right? You think of Target had a whole social movement of people just shopping amazing products they found at Target that they did on their own. And I think of, when I worked at Chewy, their customer service is well known. If you look at social media, the way their customer service is empowered to help people if their pet passes away or pet has a birthday, sending them cards or paintings or different things, that those kind of engagements and how the brand shows up creates that emotional connection that you can't get if you're just kind of pushing a product.
Yeah, I love that. It's Chewy's embraced, what is our role and how do we live it beyond marketing? And it's, what can we be doing, during different consumer journey parts of the stage, buying a pet to the death of a pet, and how can we be there along the way and participate in that journey?
Exactly.
What would you tell a brand that says, I just do social media, I don't have to worry about brand?
If you don't really have a brand, you don't have guidelines, you don't understand your brand voice, like how you want to show up. If you're just doing social media, it can be a really disconnected experience for potential customers because you could show up in a super humorous, funny way in one moment and then super serious somewhere else, and people won't understand who you are, what your values are, or if you make sense for them.
And social media too, like you have to know what you're going to say or how you're going to participate. Like having a clear guardrails in terms of who my brand is, what we stand for, gives you some parameters to these are the issues we're going to participate in organic, and these are the issues we're not. These are how we're going to talk. This is how we're going to engage with the audience. And so, unless you have some of those foundational elements figured out, who we are, who we're not, how we talk, how we don't talk, like just going out and saying we have a product is wasted money. So, Jenna, you've helped shape brands at Target, Wells Fargo, and Chewy, and they've each had massive reach. But at the heart of it, brand building's about clarity and connection. And when you step into a new brand challenge, what are the first things you listen for?
When I start a new brand challenge, the areas I like to dig in are really understanding the customer and the business dynamics. So, from a customer perspective, I'm really listening for have there been any shifts in behavior? Are there unmet needs from the competition? Is there white space where we could differentiate? And then really knowing who is that ideal target audience? How do they shop our categories? What do they think about our brand, both good and bad? And what is the value proposition that we bring to those customers? From a business perspective, first it's really understanding how are you going to grow your business? And what's going on with the competition and marketplace? Are you growing share? Are you decreasing? Is there more competition? What are those dynamics you really need to understand the nuances for? Do the products and services you have meet customer expectations? Are they differentiated or are they at parity? And then what are the strongest reasons to believe from a products and services perspective that would get customers to shop your brand? Once I know those inputs, I can really look at can we pivot or sharpen the strategy to be more focused? Do we need to address any customer perceptions or rebuild trust? And can we differentiate the brand more to create that clarity and connection that you're talking about? But also, as marketers, we want to increase that efficiency and effectiveness.
You mentioned like listening to consumers. What's your go-to for kind of taking a pulse of what's happening out there with your consumer?
So, that's a great question. I think it can vary. I've worked for companies where you have intense, like 6-month long research projects, and those are great, but they can be slow to get to what you need. I've also worked with brands where we had a group of 20 people on call that if we needed to bounce ideas off of, we could reach out and do a pressure test of some of the insights. One of the most meaningful things we did was actually down and dirty, but looking at ethnography. So when I worked at Target on baby, we really needed some insights that were meaningful on Hispanics. So we did it in about 2 weeks, but we went into a handful of consumers' homes. We talked to them about how they felt about Target, about the role of baby in their lives, and we actually went shopping with them, went in their homes. And some of the insights we got from that were really unique and differentiated. And one was thinking Hispanic moms at the time really thought that baby was core to everything. Where if you looked at general market moms, it was actually the opposite, right? Don't typecast me. I'm a marathon runner, I'm a business executive, and I'm a mom. But don't like typecast me as a mom across everything. But Hispanics, it was actually the inverse. And then as you think of how you bring things to life, another insight for Hispanics at baby was that I think in English, but I feel in Spanish. And you think of how do you use that when you use Spanish language? And that was part of like a diaper sale could probably just be in English, but the baptism or first birthday or first time your child walks, those emotive moments where you really want to connect with Hispanics probably needed to be in Spanish language to really break through.
You've said before, and this kind of ties into that like products are part of the brand. How do you make sure that everything you talk about in marketing truly represents the brand?
Brands used to have this totally separate brand marketing. You think of the 80s and 90s and these anthem TV spots about the brand. But there is a trend where companies are moving away from this with the understanding of why you have this brand that's super valuable. Most of the time, customers experience your brand through your products, your services, or the experiences you provide in store online. So as you think of current ad campaigns like for Apple or Target or Walmart, these ads are done in a brand voice and tone, but they're focused on the products and services that are most relevant to their audience. So to me, this makes total sense, right? Because the customer doesn't differentiate your brand from your products and services. So thinking of them separate can create an unnecessary disconnect. And when marketing can bring strategies to the table that take into account the business and think about the brand through the products and services, you can build a brand that is a strategic foundation to drive the business instead of building the brand as a marketing campaign. So, knowing this, to your question, how do you ensure that the products and services are the right ones that you're talking about? And I think if you're a small business, there's a couple tools that you could use. And one is first and foremost strategically thinking about whether it's a brand positioning, a brand purpose, a brand promise. They can have lots of different names, but really thinking about what is your brand delivering for the customers. And as you're doing that, the products and services should be an input to that, not an output afterward. So you're making it part of your core strategy. The second strategic component then is when you get to marketing campaigns. So you and I have worked at lots of agencies with different companies. There's all sorts of different brief formats, but they all have some similar components, right? There's an objective, there's an insight, there's a key message, there's a reasons to believe. The best way to integrate is having the products and services integrated throughout those core strategy components. And it shouldn't just be an executional consideration after the fact. So as you think about strategy being hard choices, right? It is easy to say, like, we want to drive growth across everything. All the products are important. But marketing should really be talking about the most meaningful products that will bring customers in the door or differentiate your brand.
I love that. Apple is doing such a brilliant job. They started back in the day, they Think Different, and they had these big
Mhm.
emotional stories that they told. And now you learn about Apple through their products, and their advertising is all product based. It's telling a story that's emotional, that's still got some human insight, but it's centered around a specific product, whether it's the recall a text or the adaptive technology. It's storytelling, but it's product based storytelling.
Yes. And it's so integral. And you think of how people use Apple, it is through the technology, right? Like they're not engaging with Apple, the brand, outside of the products themselves or the services if they're going in to get help.
Yeah. I think that's critical for, charities and not for profits or small businesses. It's everything you're doing is part of your brand. It's not just the messaging and marketing. It's what is your product? What are the things you're going to highlight? How are you showing up? How is guest services or, when someone answers the phone to book an appointment with your plumber, how do you convey the brand and be authentic to who you are?
The thing too is that you don't need to talk about every product you have, right? Some of that will be discovery and through your marketing. You might want to increase sales across everything, but marketing's job might be different, right? Whether your business goal is acquisition or if it's retention or basket building, how are you using the best products that are going to drive those business results? And I think that can be scary for some brands, right? Because it's like I want to talk about everything. And I've worked on big brands that even like you have an $8 billion business, and when you initially ask a business partner where are you going to grow, they're like, I need to grow everything. And it's like, no, like we can't talk about everything in an $8 billion business and drive meaningful growth. But let's break it down as far as who we can talk to and where you're going to see the biggest growth or what are the most meaningful customers to bring in, and the rest there'll be a halo. But I think having those strategic conversations and making those difficult decisions are sometimes hard at first, but then it's exciting when you get into it. It's like, oh, we have such clarity, right? Like we're not trying to be everything to everybody. We know we can drive the most growth with this customer with these three products,
Yeah.
and that can actually be liberating to teams.
So many small businesses struggle to articulate their brand. Are there any questions or exercises that you've used to help teams see the label from the outside of the bottle, quote unquote?
Yeah, I think there's a couple tangible things that small business owners can do. So some is probably creating what you might call artifacts, right? Some things that gain alignment and understanding of the brand at a strategic level. If you don't create some of these things, there can be a lot of different interpretations, which can lead to misalignment. So I think there's a strategic tool, which could be a simple one pager. And then there's some tactical tools that can help executional and creative teams. So, from a strategic perspective, I think a brand strategy one pager, and I think the goal here is it doesn't need to be perfect, but as long as it is directionally where you're going, that alignment you can create is super helpful. So on there, I'd have your brand purpose, and we talked about brand purpose in one of the other questions, but really a simple way to lay out a brand purpose could be to have a Venn diagram, and you could have three circles. One is your customer, one is your business, one is your brand. And for the customer circle, you want to think about what do customers want? What need do you fulfill? What target audience are you trying to reach? And from a business perspective, it's like, how are you going to grow? What products and services are your best, right? What are your kind of shining stars in your lineup? And then as you think of the brand, it's why do you exist? How are you different from the competition? What need do you fulfill for your customers? And if you take those three circles and at the center is your brand positioning, and really you can just write a sentence that's kind of summarizing those elements. And like I said, it doesn't need to be perfect, but I think bringing that to life really helps teams understand where you're going and what you're trying to do. From there, you some tactical tools that can be really helpful in keeping alignment in how you show up in the marketplace would be some simple brand guidelines. Now, when you hear brand guidelines, there are brands that spend months and months and have super in depth brand guidelines. I don't think that is necessarily needed for every brand, but some high level guidance could be helpful. You want to include some of the strategy one pagers so the creatives and other teams understand those components. But then you want to show how do you visually represent your brand, right? What are your thoughts on photography, on typography? What is your brand tone and voice? And brand tone and voice is one that sometimes a little bit more detail can be helpful. You know, when I worked at Wells Fargo and I oversaw all of our brand education and governance, we did find that tone was the one thing when we did creative reviews that often had the most variance. And so, one thing we did, we developed a more robust training, but there was a simple component of doing an is and is not. So, for example, if your brand is intelligent, that can be interpreted many different ways through copy. But if you can put some guardrails to it, maybe your intelligence is savvy, but not a know it all. Or if your brand is humorous, maybe your humor is clever, but not slapstick. So, how do you create a bit more guardrails for teams as they start to bring your brand to life in the marketplace?
Yeah, we spend a lot of time in the 3D brand system in the course talking about it's all about alignment, not perfection. And it's about getting some things on a page so that your team is empowered to act quicker and make faster decisions, because they're all marching to the same drum or they've grown in the same direction. And so, uh, yeah, what you say about like it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be on a page is really
Well, and
true.
your brand should be a living, breathing thing, right? So it can evolve. So if you start and there's something that changes because of your products or evolves over time, the nice thing when it's not so precious, right? If you're more fluid with it, is that you can evolve to in real time to what's happening in the marketplace and with your business to ensure it's up to date.
What about thinking about like long-term thinking and vision? Like I know at Wells Fargo you oversaw multi-year brand planning. Do you have an approach to balancing today's need with also building a brand that's relevant in 5 or 10 years?
It's a great question because I think there's always going to be tension between the long term and the current needs. And it's a healthy tension because it is a bit of an art. And if there isn't tension, it means you're probably not pushing far enough. I like to think of the long term planning as being aspirational. You want to push into the direction that you've identified, but there does need to be some pressure testing periodically with the current situation or with where the company's evolving to ensure when you get 2, 3 years down the road, there's not a disconnect. But the nice thing about creating an aspirational long term goal is if everyone is moving toward it, that there should be alignment down the road. But sometimes a disconnect happens. And one industry example, which is used a lot in strategy case studies, is CVS Health. And so CVS used to be CVS Caremark, right? And when they were transitioning to CVS Health, their long term goal was to help people on a path to better health, right? So that's where they wanted to go. But as you looked at their current situation, they sold some tobacco products in 7,800 stores nationwide. And the thing that was brilliant about CVS is they realized this disconnect could not live together, right? So they either needed to change their positioning as far as what they wanted to be or relook at the products that they sold in the store. And so what CVS did, and it had obviously some monetary impact, but they exited the tobacco business in all 7,800 stores nationwide and then launched their positioning to help people on the path to better health. And they were really the first pharmacy chain to make a big move about embracing health and actually showing, like putting their money where their mouth was and actually exiting profitable businesses to illustrate that.
I think that's also a great example of like that wasn't there was marketing behind it, but it was actually what they were doing that became the marketing. You know, it was a brand act and it was like living out their core values or living out their brand promise in a way that was like, hey, we know who we are. We've done the exercise to figure out, define ourselves. Now, when we think about that, what we're putting out in the
Mhm.
market, we're kind of dreaming about what we want to be in the future. We need to start shifting and changing what we're offering people, and that's just as powerful, and people notice, and that gets picked up. That's an earned media play as well. So even if you're a smaller brand, there are ways that you can continually figure out who you are and where you want to go and adjust, and that can create noise and create conversation, but also just build your brand.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that brand promise, brand vision, to your point, if it's done right, it is not just for marketing. Right. So, and I even think of at Target, the idea of expect more, pay less, right? That was often a filter for product people, right? Like it wasn't just for marketing. You think of what are you bringing to your customers? It's not
Mm.
just about getting cheap products, but how are you bringing that expect more into the equation which leads to solutions like design partnerships, right? Instead of just like, here's the cheapest item you could get. But I think the more you can make that vision relatable and clear, then all teams internally start to use that as a North Star and kind of an aspiration to work toward.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, people think brand and they tie it naturally to marketing, but that's
Right.
just a small piece of it. Like you said, the internal brand, the internal how your everyday decisions are getting made from the people picking up the phone to making orders, all of that is impacted. So the more you can get them aligned and have set a really nice vision, the better, you're going to operate as a company, whether or not you're even putting money into marketing.
And that's why it's important to really put some of this on paper. Like we both said, it doesn't need to be perfect, but I think if it lives in some leader's head, if there's a comment, there's just not enough alignment for people to see it and work toward it. Where sometimes even the simplicity of putting something on a sheet of paper and sharing it out and being like, this is what we're doing, gives people something to focus on.
So, do you have any examples of a brand that had a solid foundation but needed help dreaming bigger? What helped unlock that shift?
Yeah, so there's a strategy exercise called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. I don't know if you've ever used those. Have you, Dustin?
Yeah, in the course we call them the greatest imaginable challenge. Uh, and it is that sort of like, how do you set a 5, 10 year audacious goal that everybody works towards? And I think that to your point of having a clear sense of where to go, and then you track that back to performance reviews, you track that back to investment, what are we investing in a company, so that it all really hits that hairy audacious goal or is all in favor of that destination.
Well, and it's a framing, right? But it's one way to think about if you want to be, to your point, like really push for a bigger dream. And there's a classic strategy example that I love that's very old, but I think it gets to the power of creating a vision and dreaming big and gaining alignment from not only your customers, but from your employees. So in the early 60s, NASA had a brand purpose of establish a US leadership in space and counter the Soviet space achievements. And this was not incorrect, right? Is what they wanted to do, but they really wanted to align everybody during the space race. And a story that kind of shows how this came to life is, in 65, JFK went to NASA and he saw a man with a broom like cleaning in the hallway, and he stopped the man and he asked, what do you do here? And the man looked at JFK and he replied, I'm helping to put a man on the moon, Mr. President. And I think this is a prime example of the power of a clear brand purpose. Imagine in that time, like going to NASA, and whether you were an astronaut, an engineer, or the person sweeping the floor, Like you knew everything you were doing was helping to put a man on the moon. And I think that can be just so impactful and empowering to everyone involved.
Okay, to summarize, like all of our conversation, like what do you have any like your one or two principles that you could take from those billion-dollar businesses and apply it to a small brand or small business or not for profit?
Yeah, I think the first is really about differentiation. How do you differentiate your brand and its products from the competition? This is vital in really communicating why you exist to customers, right? Ideally, it's part of your business plan, but putting it on paper and why someone would want to shop you versus a competition and understanding that can really help you have a clear lane for where your brand lives. The second one is about really finding your insight and thinking of really understanding who your target audience is and what are their needs and preferences. And it's interesting because Dustin, you and I have talked that with performance marketing, there's actually been a shift in some companies in not really honing in on a target audience, right? They're like, hey, we just run ads on Meta and Google and they self optimize, and eventually we reach the people who are going to engage with it. But I feel like the disconnect is like marketing 101, we've worked together a long time ago. It's the right message to the right audience. So that nuance of how the creative can deliver, if you really understand the challenge, the reason, the motivators and barriers for your specific customer, and if you're able to address those in creative, you should be able to be much more efficient and effective in your marketing than if you're just putting a general message out to everyone and letting it self optimize.
Yeah, your marketing dollars are going to work harder when you are very, very specific both in what you're saying and where you're saying it. And it's the difference. Like, it's worth learning. If you're doing paid social or you're even on organic, like, don't just hit that boost paid. Take some time to go in there and actually set a little bit of an audience. They do a good job of letting you pick sort of demographic or like psychographic sort of interests. Pick that because you're going to have a much better chance of having it. You spend your dollars on a more fertile field, essentially.
You'll get greater engagement with the right people versus just having a lot of people see an ad that probably isn't the most relevant to them.
Well, Jenna, I super appreciate you joining today. Conversation about brand and how it can apply toward smaller brands or smaller businesses and not for profits. And you've had years of experience, and I appreciate you bringing some ideas and some nuggets to the audience.
Thank you for having me, and it's been fun to talk through branding and to catch up.